The grocery store buzzed with its usual mid-afternoon energy, shopping carts rolling, cash registers beeping, distant chatter blending with the occasional cry of a toddler. Aisles stood tall and orderly, filled with the mundane and the necessary. Somewhere between the frozen foods and the cereal section, the scent of fresh bread from the in-store bakery tried to soften the humdrum rhythm of a Tuesday. People moved through the space with a kind of autopilot familiarity, immersed in lists and quiet thoughts. At the express checkout line near the front of the store, a small drama was brewing, one that would soon split the air wide open. She was already irritated before she entered. A woman in her late 50s, with tightly permed hair and a phone clutched like a lifeline, she navigated the store with clipped steps and louder than necessary sighs. She wasn't used to waiting, not in line, not for help, and certainly not behind people she believed didn't belong. As she loaded her basket onto the conveyor belt, canned soup, boxed wine, a tabloid magazine, her eyes flitted behind her to the man who had just stepped into line. She tensed immediately. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, his dark skin smooth beneath a short beard, his posture relaxed but confident. He wore a dark gray hoodie, plain jeans, and worn sneakers. In his hand, he held only a few items: almond, milk, protein bars, a bag of apples. Nothing about him was loud or aggressive, yet his very presence seemed to unsettle her. She turned around and stared directly at him. He noticed, of course, but didn't respond. Instead, he gave a polite half-smile, the kind of silent acknowledgement people often share in a checkout line, then looked away. But she didn't. Her stare became something else, harder, narrowed, invasive. "Of course," she said, half to herself, but loudly enough for those around her to hear. "They're everywhere now." The man raised an eyebrow but remained quiet. A young couple 2 spots behind him exchanged nervous glances. A woman with a baby in her cart froze as she picked up a pack of diapers, ears perking at the tension. Brewing nearby. The cashier, a teenager who had just started the job 2 weeks ago, continued scanning items with wide eyes and trembling hands. The woman sniffed and then muttered again, this time more clearly. "This is why this country's going downhill. Can't even do my shopping without being followed." That was when he finally turned to face her, calmly. He didn't raise his voice or puff out his chest. He simply looked at her with the same expression he might offer someone asking for the time. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone even unbothered. "Yes, actually," she snapped, taking a step toward him, suddenly emboldened by her own anger. "People like you. You come here, ruin everything, and act like you own the place." He blinked. "People like me." "You heard." "Me," she said. Her voice was rising now. "You don't even belong here. Why don't you go back to Africa?" The words slammed into the air like a gunshot. The line went dead quiet. The cashier stopped mid-scan. The young couple looked down at their shoes. The woman with the baby clutched the handle of her cart tighter. The man didn't flinch. He didn't frown or look away. He just stood there staring at her with an unreadable expression. Something in his eyes shifted, not anger, not fear, but something more resolute, as if he were weighing the centuries of history behind those words. He had heard them before. Maybe not today, maybe not this way, but the sentiment was familiar. It was always the same. The tone. The venom hidden behind thinly veiled ignorance. The assumption that because his skin told a different story, his presence was unwelcome. He wasn't new to it. He just hadn't expected it in a grocery store on a Tuesday, in front of frozen pizzas and checkout scanners. A man a few steps away cleared his throat, uncomfortable. But no one said anything. The woman still stood with her jaw clenched, her mouth slightly twisted in a smirk of self-satisfaction. To her, those words were a dismissal, a command, a weapon. She believed they could reduce him, shrink him into silence, send him away embarrassed, inferior. But he didn't move. For a second, nothing happened. The air held its breath. People waited for him to yell, to match her rage with his own, to escalate the moment into chaos. But he stayed still, his gaze level, his expression calm. And in that stillness, something began to shift, not just in him, but in the atmosphere around them. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The power she thought she held began to crack. He could have turned away. He could have laughed it off. He could have said nothing. But he knew in his bones that silence would serve her, not him. That silence would teach everyone watching that what she said was okay. That she could speak cruelty into the world without consequence, and that he would not allow. So he took a single step forward, not threatening, but unflinching. People leaned in, drawn by a gravity they couldn't name yet. They didn't know what he was going to say. Neither did she. But everyone knew it was coming. Something important. Something unforgettable. And then, with the faintest lift of his brow and the gentlest tilt of his voice, he began to speak. "Africa?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the air, heavy with centuries of misused meaning. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the silence, slipping through the stunned stillness of the store like a sudden breeze in a closed room. He looked at her, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something far more unsettling to someone. Like her, composure, strength without violence, intelligence without arrogance. He wasn't performing. He was standing in a truth that needed no applause. "You mean the continent where humanity began?" he said slowly, deliberately. "The birthplace of civilization. The place that gave the world science, astronomy, architecture, medicine, philosophy and art, long before Europe even found its way out of the Dark Ages." People didn't move. No one dared. It wasn't just what he was saying. It was how he said it. Like he had waited for this moment, not because he wanted to humiliate her, but because it mattered that someone like her, and everyone watching, heard what had been buried for too long. "Africa," he continued, "isn't some afterthought in history. It's the beginning, the cradle of everything we know. And you tell me to go back, like it's an insult. But if I did, I'd be returning to brilliance, to legacy, to kingdoms that built universities while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to read." He took another step forward. Not menacing, never that. It was the kind of step that closed the space not to intimidate, but to bridge. His voice remained calm, even warm, but it carried a gravity that forced the words to land hard. "You think telling me to go back makes me less American? As if the soil under your feet belongs more to you than it does to me. My ancestors were dragged here in chains, sold, whipped, raped, forced to build this country for free. Their blood watered its foundation, and their backs carried its weight for generations. If anyone has the right to call this place home, it's the people who were forced to build it without being allowed to own a single brick." The woman's face tightened, her lips pursed, her arms crossed. But she said nothing. A man in the next line stopped moving, his credit card halfway to the chip reader. The cashier's fingers hovered in midair, holding a barcode scanner she forgot to lower. The mother with the baby in the cart leaned forward, her eyes wide. the baby quiet for the first time. He didn't let the silence grow stale. He filled it. You think because I wear a hoodie, because I speak soft, that I don't know who I am, he said. I know exactly who I am. My roots run deep, not just through this country's soil, but through history's truth. You want me to disappear, to shrink myself, to carry your comfort on my back like my ancestors carried steel and cotton? I won't. He looked around then, not at her but at everyone else, at the bystanders who hadn't said anything yet. The people who had chosen silence, maybe out of fear, maybe out of uncertainty, maybe out of the hope that if they pretended it wasn't happening, it would somehow go away. I didn't come here to teach a history class, he said. I came to buy apples and almond milk. But since I'm here, since I've been dragged into this moment, again, let's be clear. He turned back to the woman. If I go back to Africa, I take with me the rhythm in your music, the soul in your food, the swagger in your fashion, the genius in your inventions. I take the courage, the culture, the resilience, the fire. I take everything that makes this country interesting, innovative, and beautiful. Because we didn't just survive slavery, we transcended it. We created jazz, blues, hip-hop. We invented the traffic light, the pacemaker, the blood bank. We built cities, led revolutions, changed laws, inspired movements. He paused. Let it all breathe. But you, he said, softer now. What would you take with you? Hate, bitterness, an outdated fantasy where people like me were invisible and people like you never had to confront history. Is that the legacy you're proud of? Because I wouldn't be. The woman's eyes darted, scanning for someone to agree with her, but no one did. Not anymore. Even those who hadn't spoken were now visibly moved, some shifting uncomfortably, some nodding subtly, others just watching, absorbing. His voice softened further, so much that people had to lean forward to catch his last words. You don't scare me, he said, because I come from a line of people who looked fear in the face and kept walking, who were spit on, burned, lynched, and still found a way to sing, who were told they were nothing and still rose to be everything. So next time you feel the urge to tell someone like me to go back, remember, we never left. We've always been here, and we're not going anywhere. Then he fell silent. There was no sound at first, just the low hum of the refrigerated cases and the distant beep of an unattended checkout lane. The woman stood frozen, her face a mix of confusion and discomfort. No one spoke in her defense. No one needed to. Her words had already failed her, and slowly, something else began. Quiet at first. A ripple, not a wave. Applause. Soft, deliberate, beginning with a single person. An older man, in a flannel jacket near the self-checkout. Then another. Then another. Not loud or performative, but real. Honest. No one cheered, no one shouted. They just clapped, like they knew they'd witnessed something they wouldn't forget. Like the weight of his words was still sinking in. He didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't even nod. He just turned, his grocery bag now in hand, and walked toward the exit with the same calm he had walked in with. Dignity untouched, truth delivered, mission fulfilled. The applause didn't roar. It wasn't theatrical or explosive. It was quiet, measured, more like a collective release of breath, a signal of recognition than celebration. It spread in waves, from one end of the checkout lines to the other, like ripples across a still pond, disturbed by truth. It wasn't for show, it wasn't for him. It was for what he'd said, for what he'd stood for what he reminded them all, that dignity doesn't shout, and strength doesn't always need fists. The woman who had thrown her insult like a spear now stood alone with her groceries half scanned. Her cheeks flushed a mottled red that wasn't just embarrassment. It was the crumbling of superiority, the collapse of a carefully constructed illusion. Her gaze darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up, to validate her, to make her feel right again. No one met her eyes. The cashier, hands still slightly trembling, resumed scanning her items without a word. He didn't look up. Didn't offer her the usual plastic smile. Didn't ask if she wanted paper or plastic. Just scanned and bagged, as if she had vanished into the very air her words had polluted. She tried to speak once, just a small word, something like, well, or I didn't, but it died in her throat. Because what could she say? What apology could dig her out of the hole she had so publicly carved for herself? No one stopped her from speaking, yet she couldn't find the will, not after what she had just witnessed. Outside, the sky had turned a soft late afternoon grey. The man who had spoken, who had held his ground with more grace than most could muster, pushed open the glass door and stepped into the cool breeze. It caught the edge of his hoodie and fluttered it slightly behind him as he walked across the parking lot. He didn't look back, not because he was angry or above it all, but because there was nothing to go back to. The moment had passed. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was behind him. He reached his car, a used sedan with a dent in the rear bumper, and popped the trunk. He placed his bag gently inside, shut the trunk with a quiet click, and leaned against the car for a moment, just for a breath, just to let the world settle. Inside the store, conversation slowly resumed. Hesitantly at first, then gradually, like a normal rhythm trying to find its way back. The buzz returned, but something had shifted. The shoppers weren't the same. Not quite. They moved with a little more awareness now, a little more thoughtfulness. Near the entrance, a young woman in her 20s turned to her friend and whispered, "Did you hear what he said about building the country? About the inventions?" Her friend nodded. "I didn't know that stuff about Africa," she admitted. "I mean, I guess I never really thought about it that way." An elderly black man who had watched from a few aisles over stood near the produce section now, still staring toward the door. He smiled faintly, nodded to himself, and whispered under his breath, "That young brother did us proud." Back outside, a small voice interrupted the man's quiet moment. "Excuse me." He turned. A boy, maybe 11 or 12, stood a few feet away with his hands jammed into the pockets of a too-big jacket. His mother stood behind him, unsure, her eyes cautious but kind. "Sorry," she said quickly, as if afraid she'd be mistaken for someone else. "He just wanted to say something to you, if that's okay." The man nodded. "Sure." The boy looked up, eyes wide, nervous. "I just wanted to say, that was really cool. What you said in there. I never saw anyone do that before. You weren't even mad. You just told her the truth. That was brave." The man's eyes softened. He bent down slightly so they were eye to eye. "It wasn't about being brave," he said. "It was about being honest. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. But it's still the truth." The boy nodded like he was filing it away for later, like he would carry those words into 100 moments yet to come. "Thank you," the boy said. The man gave a small smile. "Thank you for saying that." They walked away, mother and son, heading back toward their car. The boy looked back once as if he knew he'd remember this moment for a long time. Back inside, the woman who had started it all was gone. Slipped out quietly, pushing her cart a little faster than usual. She didn't say anything to anyone as she left. Maybe she would forget it by next week. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe, in her own way, she was already building a story in her head to make herself the victim. Or maybe, just maybe, something had cracked open inside her. But this story wasn't about her anymore. Later that night, someone who had filmed the incident on their phone uploaded it to social media. Not for clicks, not for outrage, but because they felt the world needed to hear what was said. The video spread, not like wildfire, like a slow, determined tide. People watched it and didn't just see a confrontation. They saw a lesson, a mirror, a blueprint. Comments flooded in. "This man said everything I've always wanted to say." The grace he held was beautiful. This is what power looks like when it doesn't shout. But by then, the man was at home, sitting on his small couch, a cup of tea in hand, his phone set face down beside him. He wasn't checking for likes. He wasn't waiting for praise. He didn't even know the video had gone viral. He had no need to relive the moment, because he had already lived it. Spoken his truth. Moved on. In his quiet apartment, he turned on some jazz, leaned back, and let the saxophone carry him far away. Not back to Africa, not into anger or regret, but into the deep, undisturbed peace that only comes from standing your ground in a storm and knowing you didn't lose yourself in the wind.